Looking back at the history of the small launch space in the commercial space industry really goes to show just how remarkable and outstanding the Electron rocket is. This little workhorse is clearly the king of the small launch section. Let's take a look at previous attempts at small launch to show why Electron really stands out from the pack. Starting off with the Falcon 1 rocket, the vehicle that really kicked off the commercial space revolution in the United States, the rocket had 3 successive launch failures, and then with the company on the brink of bankruptcy, SpaceX finally launched the Falcon 1 successfully on September 28th of 2008. This successful demonstration of their capabilities helped SpaceX to win several NASA contracts that ultimately saved the company, and this causes the Falcon 1 to largely be considered a success by historical standards. But fascinatingly, after only a single commercial payload being delivered to orbit, SpaceX still decided to scrap the Falcon 1 rocket, abandon the small launch market entirely, and move on to the Falcon 9 rocket that everybody knows today. Next up, we have Launcher 1 from Virgin Orbit. An interesting concept for a small launch vehicle. The Launcher 1 from Virgin Orbit would launch horizontally after being released in the air from a Boeing 747 plane, theoretically allowing for much more flexibility by launching from any modified airport in the world. Virgin Galactic originally began working on this concept all the way back in 2007, before Falcon 1 had even successfully launched. However, 16 years later, after only 4 successful flights and 2 failures, Virgin Orbit has been forced to file for bankruptcy. The company is still hoping to launch another rocket and convince investors to come and save the company, emerging from bankruptcy protection, but I have severe doubts about the future of the vehicle, and at the very least, it won't be playing a major role in the small launch market for several years to come. After being founded in 2016 by Chris Kemp, Astra Space made a splash in the global launch industry by making huge aspirational goals for their announced Rocket 3 system. Going public in 2021, the company was valued at $2.1 billion, mostly on the back of promises of frequent, cheap launches from their Rocket 3.0 system, despite never having launched successfully as of yet and having no plans for reusability. On August 28th of 2021, the Rocket 3.3 vehicle unexpectedly went sideways off the pad and the flight was terminated as a failure. 3 months later, however, another Rocket 3.3 vehicle did successfully reach orbit. In February of the following year, the rocket experienced another failure during stage separation. And then, after a successful return to flight, Astra failed again in a tropics mission for NASA, and then announced that they were canceling the rocket entirely, yet another company which had given up on its first small launch vehicle to move on to a larger rocket. Development of the Firefly Alpha rocket began back in 2015, although the company did go through bankruptcy and a reorganization before ever getting Alpha off the ground. The vehicle was redesigned to be larger, and eventually a first launch was attempted in September of 2021. Unfortunately for Firefly, this launch did not reach orbit when one of the engines failed during ascent. A second test flight took place on October 1st of 2022, and this flight did reach orbit. However, due to performance issues on the second stage of the rocket, the satellites did not reach their intended orbit and re-entered the Earth's atmosphere much earlier than scheduled, leading most to consider the launch a failure. The next scheduled launch for Alpha is tentatively planned for May of 2023. However, the company has already gone bankrupt once. They are working on several other projects. Alpha has yet to launch successfully, and the future of the vehicle does still seem to be in question. Relativity Space was founded in 2015 and successfully raised huge amounts of capital on the private markets with the idea of 3D printing their entire rockets, promising faster iteration on their designs and cheaper rocket development. The Terran 1 rocket was indeed 3D printed, and although it is much larger than the Electron, it is still considered a small lift launch vehicle. Many questions were raised about the viability of 3D printing large tanks and other structural components of rockets, but just a few weeks ago, 8 years after the founding of Relativity, the Terran 1 finally took to the skies for their first and last time. The first stage had a flawless launch, however the engine on the second stage failed to ignite properly. Despite passing several difficult hurdles on their first attempt, Relativity decided to immediately scrap their Terran 1 rocket following this failure and focus on making a larger Terran R rocket. ABL is a lesser-known company in the commercial launch space in the United States. They were founded in 2017 by former SpaceX employees and began work on a small rocket called the RS-1, capable of carrying a little over 1 ton to orbit. This puts the RS-1 more in the category of the Terran 1 or Firefly's Alpha, slightly larger than Rocket Lab's Electron, but still in the small launch category. On January of 2023, the maiden flight of the RS-1 rocket failed and the rocket exploded on the pad off the coast of Alaska. ABL is planning to attempt another launch no earlier than June of 2023, but as of 2023, they are already working on a larger rocket to compete for national security launch contracts, and the future of the RS-1 is still in doubt. So as I think back on all these commercial attempts at a rocket, a trend has become immediately apparent to me. Most companies seem to be attempting to start off with a smaller launch vehicle. They have several failures, several mishaps. They tend to ultimately scrap their small launch vehicle and chase after the large launch space. Rocket Lab's Electron is the one outlier here. They've been successfully launching since their very first launch with only a few failures that they were able to figure out the cause of. They've now implemented a reusability plan for the rocket. They're increasing their launch cadence every year, looking at breaking even and eventually turning a profit with 50% gross margins for the vehicle. All these newcomers seem to be failing and struggling with the small launch industry, which is a very difficult place to compete in, while Rocket Lab seems to have that whole area of the market on lockdown. We have the canceled Falcon 1, the canceled Terran 1, the RS-1, which has exploded and is still under work. The Firefly Alpha has failed twice and is still being worked on, as well as Virgin Orbit's Launcher 1, which has recently gone through bankruptcy, and Astra's Rocket 3, which failed several times and was ultimately canceled, leaving the whole company's future in severe doubt. Given all this evidence over the past few years, I think it's safe to say that Rocket Lab's execution is excellent, and it is indeed much harder to launch consistently than to just launch once, as we've seen several of these players manage to launch successfully once and then fail to continue to launch regularly and make a real business out of it. This leads me to believe that Electron has a very secure place in the small launch industry. I don't think any other vehicle comes even close to it, and anyone who wants to try to disrupt it has an extremely difficult task on their hands. The price tag for an Electron is only $7.5 million, and if you're trying to put a payload on that may cost $20+ million on an unproven rocket, the risk is simply just not worth saving a couple other $1 million trying to undercut this vehicle. That doesn't even take into consideration the increase in insurance costs for insuring your payload on these newer unproven vehicles, which is clearly very difficult to accomplish. So for these reasons, I've never been more confident in the Electron's future, the fact that they're going to reach profitability. Every other company so far seems to have abandoned the small launch space to move on to a larger launch. Not Rocket Lab, they're going to play in small launch, but also the medium launch space with their Neutron rocket, and I think Electron will have a bright future ahead of it for many years to come. I just don't see them being disrupted anytime soon, and it's an extremely bright future for the Electron at this point. That is why I feel Electron is still, many years later, the king of the small launch space. Thanks you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please give me a like and subscribe down below if you're not already. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.